everyone. My name is Katrina, and I'm here with Sarah, and we are having our program about oral histories, so a link to your past, recording oral histories. And if anyone has been ever interested in talking with family and friends and recording it, this would be a great just kind of a way to get you started. And our presenter today is going to be Michael Hosking, and he would really like your input. So, thing is, we would love for you to make mention in the comments if you have questions or if there's anything that you'd like to know, you'd like to ask our presenter. Please make sure that you mention it in the comments and we will get those to our presenter. Otherwise, I'm going to introduce our presenter. Michael Hosking is the museum curator at Harpers Ferry National Historical Park. He curates the oral history program at the park, making these oral histories accessible to the public. He has also worked at Harry S. Truman National Historic Site in Independence, Missouri, as well as Minuteman Missile National Historic Site in Phillips, South Dakota, expanding their oral history programs and making them accessible as well. So thank you for joining us today, and please go ahead.
Okay, let me go ahead and get my screen shared here. There we go. And like Katrina said, I have had a lot of experience with oral histories, but not as much as many. Unfortunately, I have a fairly shy personality, so it's not a thing I really enjoy doing until I really get into it and start the interviews. That's when it becomes a lot of fun. But with the 3 sites I've worked at, I've worked on about 25 or so oral histories in different capacities. So what I'm wanting to do is just kind of go through some of the professional standards and why we do what we do, but then also try and bring it back down to what could we do as ordinary people who don't have a ton of money if we want to do oral histories at home. So first of all, what is an oral history? We have the nice dictionary version of it, but in reality, it's a way of gathering people's stories. And they're involved in events that you might be interested in, and you'd like to record that for future. And there are 2 different disciplines who use oral histories. Ethnography, which is the study of different cultures, use them to talk about the past, present, and then also speculate on the future. And they do this with a lot of research on the different cultures around the world, gathering stories. But then there's people like myself who are oral historians, and we would like to know more about the past. And this is taking a quick snapshot in the past and seeing what this individual has to say about that important event or that local event, whatever you're looking for. And one thing as I was working on this presentation I thought about for that little snapshot was a movie that I was really interested in a couple of years ago called Monuments Men. And I just went through a training in the museum world in December, and I was in the training with a colonel from the US Army, and they're recreating the Monuments Men for the Middle East. And thinking about how monumental World War II was compared to this one little project that involved only 300 or so individuals. It's one of those classic stories of interviewing these individuals, learning about this program, and it's that small snapshot of a very important event in a much larger world event. So that's kind of what we look at and how we use oral histories. Now with this, why do we do it? And I'll let you read through this as you're going, as I'm talking. But sound recordings are important, and that's what a lot of oral history is, and I'll get more into that as I go along. But what we're doing is we're capturing snapshots of ourselves and the people that we're interviewing. So what I'm talking about with that is a lot of people, and I'm doing it now with the hesitation, slang that we might throw out, different things like that are captured on tape. And that doesn't always translate when we start putting this in writing, quoting these individuals, or those types of practices. We had some racial terminology that was being used in oral histories when I was at Truman Home. We have neighborhoods that were nicknamed the Neck. And I had no idea because I didn't grow up in Independence, Missouri, what the Neck was. And I'm not using the term because it's politically incorrect, but it was a historically Black community, and the racial slur was put in front of the Neck, and that's what those communities were referred to by the white folks. And it was not a good thing, but it's something that has carried on through the history. And I was in an interview with a Black woman, fascinating, 5 hours that we sat in her house and talked to her. And she flat out told us what that was all about. And that was the first time I ever heard what that terminology really referred to, because she lived in the Neck. And that's how she kept referring to it in her interview. The other thing is we're losing our dialects in this country because we're starting to move around a lot more, or we've been moving around a lot more than the average person did 20, 30, 50 years ago. So you think about this New York dialect, which is being lost rapidly. And you think about people talking about Toity-Toyd Street for 33rd Street. Well, we're not seeing that anymore. So this is something that we're able to capture that on recordings and be able to preserve that when it's totally gone. And people can remember those days, or their grandparents might talk about the days when they had these folks talking to them. And, now we're starting to see our dialects turn more into ethnic dialects. So you have your Hispanic dialects, you have dialects from Italian communities or Asian. And while that's important, it's losing some of the characteristics of these big cities that we used to have. Not saying that's good or bad, but we have a harder time placing people through stereotypes. The big question I get about oral histories is, should we trust this information? We talk about the person giving the information to us as the narrator, and then someone like myself would be the interviewer. So the narrator might have difficulty remembering names, dates, even sometimes the exact placement. And that's where, as the interviewer, it's very important to do your research of these events. And if it's a family story, that gets a little bit harder, but maybe they're talking about some big event that happened in town, you can go to your local library, your historical society, and do some research on that event, or you're interested in hearing their take on that event. So you can get the overall facts about what happened, and then you step in and talk to your grandmother, for instance, and then they can start giving you their impression, their version of what happened during that event. And I had that a lot when I worked out at Minuteman Missile National Storage Site. We dealt with an intercontinental ballistic missile system. And I had a lot of people that were very proud of their service with the Air Force and wanted to talk about what they did. And every so often I would get this story and I couldn't find it anywhere else. And there's a story I was getting, I think it was about 1979. A helicopter crashed, and it was a pretty gruesome accident. And I heard it from about one person, but I couldn't find information about it. Then I followed up with an interview with someone else, and they were part of that missile wing during that time period, and they talked about the same crash and how they'd heard this happened out west in South Dakota, in the western section of the missile wing. So it started validating the first story, and you keep getting people from the same time period talking about these stories, and you can pretty much verify those stories through those individuals. There's also the desire to sound important when you get the microphone shoved in your face or clipped to your shirt. And so that can skew how this narrator talks about their past and how they might put themselves in a more important role than they really had. And again, just knowing the story, understanding the history, and understanding that might happen lets you put their story more into context. And then like the personal bias, which is my third big bullet point, we all have bias. And if you look at history throughout the history of the United States, it is biased. If you look at histories written in 1876, nothing could go wrong with our founding fathers. They were perfect. And it wasn't true. The reason was it was our centennial, so we wanted to have this wonderful history, glowing history of our country, and that has evolved from there. Now we're seeing a lot of the criticism of our founding fathers, rightfully so. Nobody is perfect. So that personal bias comes into my role as the interviewer, as well as their role as the narrator. We're all biased about our histories. So does that make it wrong? No. But as you talk more and more to people, you will realize that this bias is in there, and you'll get different people's bias. And then you can start tweaking some of those stories in the final product, whatever that may be for you. And then that will come up with your final event and what you're hoping to portray or what you're hoping to learn. And then you have it as an interpretive event. And it's not just the fact finding, but this is one person's view of this event. And you have to remember that what this is you're condensing one person's life or one person's experience into anywhere between 1 to 5 hours of conversation. And that is also condensed into that conversation into only maybe 5 to 10 minutes of something that might have been very important. So these little snapshots in history are important to remember, that there's going to be facts missed, and there's different things, different ways of achieving those gaps. And that's again through research and even with follow-ups. And I'll probably cover that a little bit later as we're going along. Now, with that background, I'm going to kind of go into this, what we do as professionals, how do we do it? And the first thing is we have to figure out what we want. What topics are we researching? What are we trying to get across? How are we wanting these stories to be told? And so, like I keep saying, you need to know your topic. You need to know who was involved in this topic. You need to know the dates, the times, and even spellings. You can ask your narrator to confirm spellings, but it's really good for you to be able to work with those spellings also. That way you're not wasting time on having them spell city names, for instance, or neighborhood names, whatever the case may be. The other thing you're trying to get people to remember, one of the best tools for this is photographs. But the problem is, and I'll go into audio versus video later, but everything I've done was audio. So how do you capture that photograph on the audio recording you're making? So you have to be very careful about doing that. And I typically make a large copy of the photograph and put numbers over the locations as we're talking, or over the people. So as they give me a name and it's like, oh, it's this person, as they point at the photograph, I'll put a number on that and say, oh, person number 1. And then that physical photograph that I'm marking up will go into my file and will eventually end up in the final product that I have, which is usually a written transcript, which again, I'll talk about that briefly later on. Come up with some questions too. You want to know what you're talking about. You don't want to just try and go off the top of your head. I know some historians do that. I am not that person. So I typically have a nice outline on paper in front of my face on a clipboard, so I can get my very basic questions to help warm people up, which you're just wanting to know: when were they born? Where were they born? Start putting them into the context of what this history is that you're trying to get. How old were they? Then you start working into, when did you move to town? How long have you been in this area? Those types of questions. And then you start going into the more of the meat of the subject that you're trying to find out. That way they're getting used to answering you, they're getting used to how you ask questions, and then they're also getting used to answering the questions you're asking. And I also take notes as I'm talking, and I do warn them I'll take notes. And the reason I'm taking these notes is they're going to say something I might want to follow up on later, and my memory is racing 500 miles an hour. What happens when I get that opportunity to follow up? Am I going to remember that question, or am I just going to get caught up in the moment and move on? So if I've written it down, I know what I want to ask, and that gives me the opportunity to follow up with this individual and keep them talking about a subject, or maybe we can digress into that subject because it sounded really cool, really important, and it was something I had not thought of on my original outline. Now, location for the interview is essential. So where are we going to record this? Are we going to do this out in a restaurant when we're allowed back into restaurants? probably not a great place. You really want to keep a quiet spot. You want it to be quiet, away from others, without a lot of distracting sounds. Some of that can be hard to do. Think about big cities, for instance. If we're doing this in Washington, D.C., even if you're inside someone's place, house, apartment, you're going to have sirens going by. That's just the fact of life, and that's what we're going to have to deal with. But then there's other distractions that might happen. I had the gentleman that I was interviewing when I was at Minuteman Missile. He was one of the original missileers in the 60s that was out there, and that's what they called the individuals that were actually there ready to launch the missiles. He had his wife with him, and she was unable to leave. She had a mobility impairment, so she was there, but she didn't quite understand exactly what was happening, and she would interject occasionally, distracting from my narrator. So ideally, it would have been nice to separate those two, but the reality was that wasn't going to happen. I had to consider their situation, how he was a caretaker. But there were other times that we ended up with multiple people in the room, and they would both interject and play off of each other and gave us a great interview. But there was also an interview I did at the Truman Home with another historian who's asking the questions. And we were interviewing one of Truman's neighbors, and her granddaughter happened to be there. And we were kind of hoping the granddaughter would leave. But it turned out the granddaughter gave a better interview than her grandmother did. She had better recollections of Truman because she was in high school when Truman had moved back to Independence, Missouri after the presidency. So she talked about jogging through the neighborhood, and she literally ran into the former president coming out of his gate. She didn't see him coming. She was distracted. She looked forward, and there he was, and she ran shoulder to shoulder into the former president with Secret Service right there. So she told about that story, and that was a story, if we had asked her to leave, we would never have gotten that story. So there's risks, and there's payoffs, and it's hard to know what to do at the time. And again, dealing with family histories, it's a little different. It might be more fun to have the family around because they can play off each other. The other thing is understand your recording equipment. If you're using professional equipment, it's quirky and has a lot of issues. Perfect example with today. We were messing around with Zoom trying to get it working, and we had to log off, log back on a couple times just to figure things out. Do that offline. Do that before you get there. Understand what's happening. That way, when the recording starts, it's pretty clean and seamless, and nobody knows you had problems, even though you might have been cussing up a storm when you were trying to figure this all out. Also, make notes, and that's not just of what the narrator's saying, but you can make notes of what type of interruptions you might be having. What were those interruptions? Who were these people? Did people walk through and make just some off comment that gets caught by your recording that's going to show up later? And it's good to know who that was. Did it matter? And the thing is with professionals, and again, I've got a page later on about transcription, I send my recordings away for transcription, and it's good for them to understand that there's this section about this location in my recording. You can ignore that person, and it doesn't have to show up in the final paper transcript. So there's different things that we can do to make notes. There's also what might be happening, what happened before you got there that the narrator might have told you about. And these are events that might affect how their recall is. They had a stressful situation that happened before your appointment. Well, maybe they're not thinking clearly as you're trying to get into this. So they're very disjointed and having problems remembering what they're doing, what they're talking about, and keeping on a good thought path. So with these notes, I go back and decide whether I'm going to do a follow-up interview with them during a better time in their life, or make decisions like that. So there's those types of notes in addition to your follow-up questions. But for the professionals, always have permission to use this in the future. Make sure you get a legal release. And pretty much for us, we try and make it as broad as possible. So we can use it during presentations, we can use it on the internet, we can use it wherever we want to. We can cite it in publications. So we have written permission to use this information. Otherwise, it's just like any other publication. It falls into personal copyright, that this is this individual's information. And unless they release it to you, you do not have permission to use it. So you waste a lot of time if you don't get those permissions. And again, as a professional, I look at some of the interviews I've done where I'm interviewing other professionals in the line of work. Those releases are less important because they're being paid by the federal government to do this job, and this is part of their job. So it becomes federal property at that point. So there's different weird caveats that I can't even start to go through all those to keep up with the permissions that you'll need. Now, I talked about what you want to do and how you want to record it. And there's a couple different ways. Audio is what I've always used. This is a very basic way of doing it. It captures the regional dialects like I talked about. It'll capture a lot of things that'll be lost in the written word. It's less technical. It is something that you can do individually very easily, but it is handy to have a second person there to play with the phone, your recording equipment, whatever. And with them on hand, they can make sure all the sound levels are getting caught properly, those types of things. Whereas video is a good method if you're working on a larger video project. And within the National Park Service, you'll see a lot of video interviews that we do because we like to include these in our park films, or we like to do interpretive programs with this video so we can enhance our interpretation of our sites. But with this, you can also use it to document a structure. You could document those photographs much easier because you can be talking about people and just point at them in pictures, or maybe, like I said, the old family homestead, you're still able to go through that and you can walk room to room and actually talk about each one. And then you could follow up and draw the house or the building or whatever you're talking about. And the newer, younger users expect video now. So you're talking about your folks that are coming into the profession, they're 20, 25 years old. They want to see who's talking, not just hear them. But the biggest problem with this is it's more technical, and you really do have to have a second person to run the equipment, and it's a lot more complicated to get set up, and the editing's even more complicated to get the final product. But then I put down both. Why both? Sometimes you can leave the audio running longer, so you're capturing things before the interview and after the interview that might be very pertinent, because even though you say you're done on recording and you're wrapping things up and you're packing things up, all of a sudden your narrator starts telling this awesome story that just you never thought about asking, and they didn't think about it when we were talking about that subject. So that's where the audio comes in really handy, because you can be packing up your video equipment and you capture that story. You can cut that extra garbage off the front and the end later through the editing process if it truly becomes garbage. But I have captured many a good story after the fact by just letting that keep running while I'm obtaining my releases, while I'm doing other paperwork, wrapping up with my informant or my narrator. So it's always a good backup. And then also, what happens at the video if the camera runs, the battery dies, for instance, or other technical issues happen with the camera, and maybe you know it at the time or you don't realize it until it's too late. At least you've captured that audio because you have that separate piece of equipment sitting there. So talking about equipment, we'll do audio first, and then I'll talk a little bit about video. With the audio, professionals, we do buy a high quality digital recorder. And let me switch your screen. And what you're seeing on the left is very small. It's actually about the same profile as a cell phone, as a smartphone, but it's about twice to maybe 3 times the thickness of that. But you can see on the digital readout, if you have a large enough screen, a left and a right, so you can monitor how that sound is coming into your recording equipment. And the thing is, it usually will record in a non-compressed format, which I'll get into a little bit later. But then you need to figure out what media is it recording on. And I grabbed an SD card image and then also a compact flash card, which is really getting dated now. But that's what I started on, was using compact flash, and that's a form of external storage. Or a lot of these have their own hard drives. But what happens if the hard drive fails? What happens if your digital media fails? So you want to have backups. I have two examples of microphones, with a stand microphone as well as a lavalier microphone. I'm a huge fan of the lavalier microphone because once it gets put on the person, usually they forget about it. You just clip it on the lapel and they start talking. But I had one person that knew it was there and started doing this with the lavalier mic. And I'm just cringing because I had no idea what it was doing to my recording. And luckily, in the end, it didn't do much at all. You could hear a little bit of the rubbing, but I was thinking it was just like rubbing your finger across the top of a microphone. That's all you're getting, is that crunch, crunch sound. So you have to be careful with that technology. Whereas that stand microphone is just in your face, sitting there the whole time, and they can see it. And that sometimes is a little intimidating to your narrator. But then you also, in that case, need a microphone stand of some sort. We usually buy a really short one that sits on a table, so it doesn't have to be that big and garish like you see in like professional studio situations or in auditorium type situations. But then always have extension cords. Always make sure you can plug things in, and power strips. That way you're not reliant on batteries that can die halfway through your presentation. Or if you want to use a battery, you always have that quick plug it in, because my battery is not as fully charged as I thought it was. But the problem with this, again, professional setup, you're looking at about $500 to $1,000 for the setup. So it's not cheap. And then I haven't even talked about the fact that we could use headphones and plug into this digital recorder and actually be able to hear the information coming into the recorder. So we know exactly what the product is that we're getting. And not just assuming that everything's coming across fine. And had I had headphones with that individual, I would have heard how much impact that rubbing on the microphone was having on my interview. So then we move into digital. Again, you need something to record on with a camera, and always have an external microphone. This one happens to be attached to the camera, but we could detach it from the camera and actually set it on the table. And the idea with the detached microphone is you can get both your narrator and your interviewer. You want to hear them both on these recordings. What I didn't say before was I had my own lavalier mic on when I was doing the interviews. So you could hear me just as well as you could hear the other person. But the other problem with the video is you have to have a nice professional tripod to set the camera on. And you also need to worry about lighting. People even use backdrops, so you can make it fairly bland behind them. So if they want to superimpose images like what's behind me right now, you could do that. Or they just do a nice bland black background, so the finished audience isn't being distracted in what's in the background. And we could probably all relate to that now, because we're all wondering what's behind the newscasters on their bookshelves or whatever. The big problem with this is we're looking at a cost setup of about $1,500 to $2,000. So you're looking at almost twice the cost, if not more, to get this type of setup. And I know in my private life, I don't have the money to cover that. So that's something to keep in mind on what the finished product is. But like I said, for a lot of what we do in the National Park Service, what we want are videos. And one of the great sites to take a look at is Minidoka National Historic Site, I believe it is, out in California. They have a huge oral history program that was a Japanese internment camp. And so there's still a lot of people alive that were either adults or children in these internment camps. And if I remember right, they've done about 600 interviews with people who were at that camp, specifically talking about life and how it affected them, what the impacts were after the fact. For the older folks who were brought into the camps, how they felt about being basically put in prison. And you can catch the emotion in their faces, the pain in their faces, and it adds to the story to have it done video. So that's one thing we can think about. But then we have standards that we have to follow. We follow Library of Congress, and you can look up on their website the oral history standards, and they'll talk about archival standards for the interviews. And the audio is pretty set in stone right now. And what I have on the screen is exactly what we're looking for. You want it to be stereo. A WAV file is an uncompressed, non-proprietary file. And that gets you into problems if you get proprietary files. And I'll talk about that more into the video. But with the compression, it gets you into problems because every time you compress a file, it takes away or replaces data on that file. So images I do a lot more of. So think about the color image. You put me in compression, it eliminates maybe 25% of the colors that I have on my body right now, takes away all the white and puts non-data in there. And that way it can replace that when you open it back up with data it thinks it should be in that image. But if you are using this, if you're working with this and you're saving it multiple times, you lose data and it becomes noticeable. And you cannot get that data back. And the same thing is true in the audio recordings and even the video files. If you're using a compression somehow, it's removing that data and it's flatlining your recording. So you might have these nice peaks of loud. Well, it tones that down. So your original recording was up here, your toned down recording's here. You save it, you get that lower recording. And then it keeps doing that as you're editing and saving as new files. So data compression is great to save space, but horrible when you're trying to do something archivally. With video, that becomes a little bit more important and your file types become more important. JPEG 2000 is a non-compressed file type, and they're trying to figure out a standard in video, and they haven't done that yet. So what I have on the screen is what they're looking at now as the standard, but they haven't made the final decision to give us advice what we're supposed to be doing. And a great example of that is, my wife works for the library. She's on this presentation, actually, as one of the moderators. But we were trying to do a story time the other day, and I'm like, well, let's use our nice Panasonic video camera. So we did everything we had to do, and then it was time to edit it. Our software didn't recognize the video type, the file type. It was a .mov file. And I had to look it up, and that's proprietary to Panasonic and Sony. Well, I had to go running around on the internet trying to figure out how to convert that to a file type that our software would recognize. So we don't want to do that when we go into the professional realm of oral histories. We want it to be saved. We want to be able to come back to it in 10, 15, 20 years and still be able to access that file as original file, non-compressed, all the data is there. So that's where we have to be careful and why we're setting these standards. And these standards are public, and there's no copyright to the standards. So we just try to gravitate towards the good sources of those. And even like the National Park Service, we don't set our standards. We use the standards from larger institutions like the Library of Congress or the National Archives or those institutions. And we just use their standards because it's so much easier. They're paying all the money to do the experimentation on this. So I've talked a lot about the equipment, a lot about your questions, a lot about all of the standards. What do we do next? So we've done our interview, we've got the recordings, we can doctor those up, we can cut those, we can do whatever we want to with them. But generally, our finished product is an oral transcript. And here's 3 examples of transcripts I've worked on in my past. 2 of them have my name on them and 1 doesn't. The Truman Home, I never actually did the interviews. I was the technical person, so I got to be in the background playing with the recorder. So that was where I got some good experience and learned from the historian that was doing the actual interview. But with the written transcript, it's the easiest one to get your information from. So you're able to read through this just like a book. Your 1-hour interview might be 25 pages. So it's a lot easier to download this PDF, flip through that real quick and say, that's worthless, I can't use that in my research, and move on. Or, wow, that had a lot of great information. This is what I want to use for my research. And then it gives you that tangible document to actually cite from. It's a little bit harder to do citations from your audio recordings, even though it's not unheard of. But then you're having to use timestamps and all of that. When I was in grad school, I took an oral history course, and as part of that course, they made me transcribe, and it made me realize how much I hate transcriptions. And it's not the finished product, it's doing it. 1 hour of clear audio with no bad background sounds or anything like that takes someone like me about 4 hours to type it. So a 5-hour interview is 20 hours of typing. So I feel sorry for the transcriptionists that had to do that interview. Professionals can get it knocked back to about half an hour of typing for every 4 hours, but they're doing it all the time. And you have to have specialized equipment. There's actually a foot pedal. It almost looks like something you use for a sewing machine that starts and stops your audio recording. So that way you're not moving your hands from the keyboard to the mouse to hit stop. You're using the foot pedal to stop it, and it makes it much more efficient. So that's how you can streamline how many hours it takes you. But then there's another $50 to pay for that foot pedal. I just looked that up this morning to see how much one of those things cost. And then, of course, everyone in today's technology, just send it through voice recognition software. It'll do it for you. It's horrible. It doesn't do everything that you want it to do. It doesn't translate the dialects very well. So if you're using slang, or I've been dropping G's on some of the words I say, and I recognize that's part of my speech pattern, it has a hard time doing that, catching that in these voice recognition software packages. They're getting better. But the problem I found is if I do that, I still spend about 4 hours correcting all the issues. I have to go through everything, finding the problems, and then correcting those. So you waste as much time doing the edits as you would just typing it from the get-go. And it could be a much more accurate document. And you can make decisions on that document from the beginning. And that is the other thing that is decided in these oral history transcripts. If you go to the Truman Home, they have a lot of their transcripts available on their website. And you will see a lot of the ums, uhs, ands, and these verbalized pauses, they're called, or the false starts, where you start a thought, say a few words, and then they stop, and then they start on a different thought. They go ahead and transcribe that because they feel like it's part of the record. I don't like that transcript as much because as a person using it for research, it makes it very hard to read and follow along. So I tend to edit those verbalized pauses out and clean up the transcript so it reads more like a book. And it makes it easier for the end researcher, but then you're losing some of the information. And the way I justify that is for everything from the Truman Home, or not Truman, I'm sorry, from Harper's Ferry, I have it available with both the written transcript and the audio file available for download on a website called IRMA, irma.nps.gov. And I don't have that as one of my resources, but that's where my information is stored. So if you want to hear the interview, you can definitely hear about that. So I've gone through the professionals. So what are my options or your options as someone who wants to do this, but you don't have even $500 to blow on professional equipment? You can get cheaper audio recorders that are more professional grade, and there's options that are about $100 for those. But again, a lot of times once you go cheaper, you start getting into compressed files. Does that matter to you? Is this personal? Is this something you're going to pass down? Is this something you might be able to tack on to ancestry.com as part of your genealogy? You know, what do you want to do with this? If you want it a little more professional, you can download apps with your cell phone. And I'm saying that's more professional, but the apps actually do help you with some of the standards, help you with some of the clarity, and help you through some of the pitfalls you might have. But then if you're going through the apps, places like StoryCorps, which is a Library of Congress partnership, they will actually store your interview for you. so you have access to your interview in the future. And that's a really cool opportunity. But you do have just a regular audio recorder on your cell phone, or you can record video on your cell phone. And it's your decision on where you want to go with that, to what you really want to do. Um, Sometimes it's just capturing that story, and you want it on tape so you can pass it on to your children, and that's fine. I keep saying tape because that's how I started, and I have tape recorder down on my list. You can't beat the old-fashioned tape. People think it's funny, but at the same time, it's a lot easier to maintain a magnetic tape than it is to maintain digital files sometimes. They still take maintenance, but what happens, as long as you have a tape recorder that still works, that tape's always going to play in that tape recorder. Whereas we've been seeing CDs, DVDs, and Blu-ray players harder to get our hands on because they're going to MP4s online. So I have my work laptop doesn't even have a CD player on it. So how do I listen to my sound recordings on CDs if I don't have something to play it on? So those are important things to think about for 5 to 20 years or even 100 years from now. How are we accessing this information? With magnetic media, an interesting experiment, if you have the equipment at home, is the magnetism on the media does move. And if you play it, it will actually move all that magnetic data back into its proper place. So if you leave a tape like this laying on its side, all the information is going to slide down to the bottom of it and become static. So if you play some old VHS tapes that you've had in your closet for 10, 15, 20 years, you might have static and a less clear image than what you had when you first bought it. And that's the magnetic media moving around on you. And there's a lot more information online about that. This is pretty basic and layman's explanation of it. But it was something I learned 25 years ago in grad school, that you have to, quote unquote, exercise your tapes, which means you need to play them once in a while and make sure that magnetic media is where it belongs. But then the downside with that is, I know I'm in my almost 50, so I remember the tape players eating my tapes, and then you've destroyed it. You might be able to splice it back together if it totally breaks, but you do have the problem of the fact you've got damaged media now. But with that said, I wanted to kind of go through a quick case study with one of the interviews that was done for Harper's Ferry. So this is an individual that went to Storer College. And what we have is the transcript. So this is a little clip of what we have written. And what I'm going to do now is play the sound clip for you that is pretty much what you're seeing on the screen. So you can see how the transcription varies from what the actual audio file is.
As I said, Storer was an integral part of our life. So my mother at that time was working as a cook at the college. And so she had her job was, to have the 3 meals for all the students, and in the kitchen. And the kitchen was the dining hall, and the kitchen was in the basement of Brackett Hall. And that's where you saw in that picture, the back of Brackett Hall. That's where we would be. We go in that way to go into the dining room and in the kitchen, and through the back part.
You mean all the students went in?
They went in because it was down under, down in the basement part of it. And not only that, my mother, I used to help my mother prepare food for the students. Especially early mornings, because even though I had 8 o'clock classes, I would get up with her at 5 and help her fix breakfast. We do part of it the night before, like lay out the bacon and stuff in the trays and things of that nature. But when it came down to cooking, you couldn't cook it the night before. You had to do it that morning. So you had to time it so that you'd have breakfast. They'd have breakfast by 6 to 7 o'clock. And because we had 8 o'clock class, I had 8 o'clock.
So with that, you kind of see how that transcript doesn't totally match what was being said. A lot of the ums and the uhs were taken out. I heard a couple false starts in there. And the other thing, I talked about follow-up questions, and you heard the oral historian jump in about, you mean all the students went in to clarify something, because what the narrator was saying wasn't totally clear about how this was working out and what she was talking about. So that's something important to think about. But at the same time, you don't want to jump in on your next question too fast, because this person might be thinking about what to say next, and they're trying to formulate their thoughts. So it's important to let people have time to think before you jump in on them. And I don't have a good example of that. But silence on the tape or silence on the recording is not a bad thing. Sometimes it's just thoughts. And so I will actually get that uncomfortable silence and let it go for almost a minute. And again, I'm face to face with the person most of the time, just to let them say that, yeah, I'm truly done with that thought. And then we can move on to my next question. Now, one thing I wanted to do too is share with you a video, and I'm going to try and keep it kind of short. But this is the same individual. They're doing a video on the cell phone, so it's not great. But she's talking about Storer College campus, and it's kind of neat how the oral historian used the video. If I can get it working. Let me stop the share on that one and go back to my original file here. That's why I get for stepping away for too long. Just a second. There we go. As I was saying, know your equipment and remember what you're doing. So we'll see how this comes across here. So this is just a quick clip of her drawing a map.
The street coming in from on the campus. And that road went all the way down behind Brackett Hall, over to Brady House, to the library, and then down other houses down there. Then there's a road behind here. There's a road behind there. Take you back on out.
So hopefully that was visible for you.
Yeah, we could see it just fine.
Good. So that's a way to use video if you wanted to. And it was an afterthought, so that's actually not in the recording or in the transcript, but it's something that we can go back to. And she gave some different narratives on the things she was drawing on there. The problem is it looked like it was kind of done as a quick afterthought. So the earlier video, you see the oral historian moving around, and it was something, if you get sick with movement, it's gonna cause you problems. So with that said, here's 3 resources that are pretty much open source. They're wanting to get the information out. The Ask Doug one is kind of a fun one, because that one is where you can go in there and search for video equipment, and he will review them and give you information on which ones are really good. So with the Oral History Association, they're a broader group. It's a professional group. To get a lot out of them, there is a membership fee. And then the Oral History in the Digital Age, that's got a lot of nice technical resources, things for you to be able to figure out more of those standards that I was talking about, different questions about how to do things, and it has a lot of professionals feeding back on what's going on in the profession and writing little snippets of articles that are easily consumable, almost like the old magazines used to be. So you're not getting buried in textbook type information. You're actually getting some very usable information. So those are 3 websites I brought up really quick. We can post these, I'm sure, at a later date. And then we can also probably get some of the others that I mentioned up. I can provide those back to the library where they can post those at a later date. So if you want to see different examples from like the Truman Home, I did not look up Minidoka before I started the presentation, but I could definitely look up Minidoka and give a direct link to where they have their oral histories, so you can see what the video oral histories look like if you're interested in that. But with that said, I am open up to questions if there are any online.
It doesn't look like we have any from Facebook.
Okay.
And you answered my question that I had about using the smartphone and if you recommended any apps available. So
yeah, and that one's tough. I didn't do a lot of research into apps specifically, but you can do a lot of your audio apps, and with the oral history in the digital age, you can go into that and probably find some recommendations on apps there. So that is an option that you can take if you choose and want to find out more. But with that, if comments come across Facebook and you're interested in more information, I have a direct link with the library. Like I said, my wife works there, so I know that you can get the questions directly to me, and I can help the library answer any questions that might come up after the fact. If you're not able to watch this live and you're watching the recording of it, don't feel like you can't ask questions on the Facebook page, or you feel like you're going to be ignored. We will try our best to get back with you.
definitely.
Well, and one thing I do want to mention is it might seem daunting to do something like this. Even just approaching an older family member with a cell phone, saying, hey, can I record you? It might seem really daunting, and they may not be really interested in doing it, but if you don't just say, can I record you? Can you say, you know, there's a story that you've told me about. I'd like more information, but I'm not going to remember all of it. Can I record you just so I will remember this for later? They're more apt to do that, than, especially if you have a purpose for remembering it later, than you just saying, I want to record you. Because if you don't give them any context, they're kind of like, why am I important? And that's the hard part. A lot of people are not that interested in just being recorded, to be recorded. Even audio, video, whichever. They might not think, oh, well, I didn't get my hair done. Especially right now, not everybody's going to a hair salon. Well, I'm not wearing a nice outfit, or, I'm just wearing a t-shirt and jeans, and that's the thing. If you just say, hey, I just want this just for me, or, that sort of thing, kind of preface it to make them more comfortable. Because you may not be recording this to share with the whole entire world on Facebook somewhere, but you might want to later. But if you can get it recorded, recording something is better than recording nothing. Just think of all of those times that you had conversations with your family and now they're gone. You don't have any of that. You just have yours. You have the memory of their stories that you can pass along, but it's wonderful to have it from them. Even if an object sparks some interest, if there's a piece of furniture, if there's a piece of jewelry, or if there's just even some simple little something, hey, can you tell me about this? Where'd this come from? They're more apt to get into, oh, well, Aunt so-and-so gave us, and go into a really nice long story about it, which might lead to more. So it can be daunting, believe me. I've done this with my mom, and she just kind of keeps looking at the camera like, I know it's there, but then she'll get wrapped up in the story and keep going. Especially if we have like a particular set of objects or something like that. Hey, can we talk about this? It works really well to keep them going. So I don't know if Mike wants to speak to that or not.
Yeah, and that's one thing I can kick myself for too. My father passed away 2 years ago, and we did a car tour a year before he passed away of his old neighborhood in Springfield, Illinois, with my daughter. My daughter fell asleep, but we got the stories, and I heard stories that I'd never heard before about the delinquent that he was, because he was always a really good guy. When I grew up with him, there was no problems. He was always straight and narrow, no problems. But he talked about the building, the fire escape that they would climb up on to hide on the roof from the people that they were throwing mud at their cars on the main drag going past his apartment building, and different stories like that that I had never heard of before. And it was just funny to hear. And now that story's lost. But he's one that would have been easy to video, and that one would have been an easy one to step out of the car, find someplace to park, and actually talk to him on the side of the road. And he could point out the places he's referring to, because that was a neighborhood he was born in and grew up in and spent his whole childhood in. So yeah, and breaking that ice with families a little bit easier. It's when you start working with people outside your immediate network. Like when I worked at Minuteman Missile, I talked to these people who used to work in the missile field and asked them, I'd like to get your story. It's like, well, you can read it in a book. No, I can't get your story from a book. I can get the general history from a book. So it was really tricky to keep working on them and to keep making them feel like their story was important and we had to get their story. And once you got them sat down and talking to you, and in that case, I did a lot of phone interviews. It was very enjoyable, and they really started opening up. But yeah, you do need to have that technique of don't take no for an answer. Keep going after the individual nicely. Don't pester them, don't hound them, but keep working on them, saying that, you know, hey, I want this to be recorded because I won't remember how to bring this across to my family. Even if you don't have family, you might have family in the future. And I talked about that early on, that your recollection of the story is going to be wrong because it's your recollection of their story. So you're going to either embellish it, you're going to forget things. I gave you some dates about the accident in the missile wing. I don't know if that was the actual year. I'm going off of information I learned 10 years ago and just winging it. So if I did my research, I could give you the exact date and time of that accident because it's out there. But that's where you have to work on them a little bit and get them at ease, get them in a comfortable spot. You know, maybe they're the type of person that has their chair, their lazy boy. And if you get them in that lazy boy, as long as it's not making a ton of noise, and get them comfortable and chatting with you, it might be easier to get their interview or get it started there. And then if you're doing video or even audio, you can get them to move at that point to the place you really want them and start talking about this cool piece of furniture that was your great grandparents, or about this picture that you don't know who's in the picture, but you think they do because they might be in that picture as a small child. And that happens a lot in my family.
Okay, so do we have is there anything in the comments or anything on Facebook?
Nothing on
No.
Facebook. No.
We're good. Okay, well, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap that up. I want to thank Mike for joining us today. We appreciate it. And
Yes, thank you.
Who visits this and watches it later will enjoy this. So thanks again for doing this. We appreciate it. It offers adult programming for the library, which is always a fantastic thing.
Yes.
As Sarah knows, in charge of that. So, well, thank you so much. And we're going to go ahead and stop it there.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.